I think we are about ready to start our final panel, and as we do this, I want to just say a couple of quick thank yous. One is to just all of our speakers who I think did a terrific job throughout the conference, so thanks to everybody. I also want to thank my colleagues at the Federalist Society who have, helped to actually make this work. So I will, the crew in the faculty division, Anthony Deerdorf, Nick Garfinkel, and Justin Drewer. And then my colleagues in the digital division, Alex Yershov and Megan Solar, and Tyler Lowe, who does some work on basically getting ideas out into the public sphere through various media. So thanks to all of them. And also thanks to Grace Gotchling, who did a fabulous job with keeping all of the details of the logistics of the meeting, going as scheduled. So thanks to Grace. And Jean, obviously, always lovely to have you here. So thanks to you for everything. And now, without further ado, let me turn things back over to our moderator for the second time, Professor Stephen Sachs, the Antonin Scalia, who holds the Antonin Scalia Professorship at Harvard.
Thank you very much, Yuli, to all of you, the Hardy Band, who are here for our closing panel. It's my honor to introduce our panel for today on America and her discontents. 30 years ago this month, a new president took office in Washington, D.C. And in his inaugural address, 31 years ago this month, in his inaugural address, he noted a variety of problems facing the nation. But he added, there is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America. Now, it may be fair to say that former President Bill Clinton is not always quoted at Federalist Society events, but I think that many in FedSoc would find themselves rather sympathetic to this claim of his. Indeed, perhaps more sympathetic than are many Americans today on both sides of the political spectrum. Rereading his first inaugural address, I was struck by President Clinton's suggestion that Americans rededicate ourselves to the very idea of America. Today, some would argue the very idea of America, the claim to the essential goodness of the Republic and of its institutions, is viewed, I think, with more hesitance, even suspicion, than in many periods in the past. Often in American history, what was wrong with America was understood as a failure to live up to its ideals. If the Lockean experiment were not going well, the reason might well be that it was not yet Lockean enough. And the proper response then would be a rededication to the American ideal, a greater effort to see the promissory notes of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence paid in full. But others, both on the left and the right, have seen America's flaws as being, in important ways, more essential than that. They are not features of the past, part of the old world from which it is the American dream one day to free us. They go to the very root of our history and to the very core of our national identity. These questions are important ones, not only for we as American citizens, perhaps, but for American lawyers and law professors as well. As lawyers, we are officers of the courts, working to carry the American legal system into effect. And as law professors, we not only study that system, but bring new generations into its practice. In so doing, we cannot avoid engaging with fundamental debates over the wisdom or the justice of American ideals. To help us consider these and other questions, we are joined today by three eminent panelists. We will start with 12 minutes of opening remarks from each, and then a round of 5-minute responses. I'll then ask some questions to start a conversation among the panel. For those of you who have questions of your own, at roughly 6:10 or so, I will invite you to line up at the microphone here in the aisle. We are fortunate to be joined today by Josh Kleinfeld, Professor of Law at Northwestern's Pritzker School of Law, by his colleague Paul Gowder, Professor of Law at Northwestern and its Associate Dean of Research and Intellectual Life, and by Nicole Garnett, the John P. Murphy Foundation Professor of Law at Notre Dame Law School. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
All right, thank you, everybody, and thank you, Steve. I want today to offer a philosophical explanation and defense of why someone might love America. It's a sort of love song. It's my very peculiar kind of philosopher's love song for the country. And as a love song, it will be idiosyncratic. It will take us from Aristotle to Hegel to a singer-songwriter who I love named Regina Spektor. But here goes. This topic, love of country, love of America in particular, is unusually prone to misunderstanding others and being misunderstood oneself. And so I want to start with a few words of clarification about what I take myself to be defending and critiquing before I get started with the main argument. First of all, I don't want to defend what I don't think is really patriotism, but jingoism. Jingoism, as I mean it, is a kind of love of country that is morally indifferent to a country's shortcomings, past or present, and resists all criticism and typically tries to whitewash the past and excuse the present. I don't mean to defend that. And I don't mean to oppose what I think is fairly common on the left of the American political spectrum, which you might characterize as a kind of demanding love. Demanding love, as I mean the term, is a critical love. It's asking the country constantly to do still better, to live up to its promise still more, and yet it is still grounded in love. It's a more critical relationship or expression of that love, like a parent who says to a child, live up to your potential, but it's still love. The difficult thing about demanding love is it's easy for bare hostility to masquerade as demanding love, and it's easy for demanding love to warp, especially over time or across the generations, into bare hostility. But I don't mean to criticize demanding love itself. As long as it's genuine, I think it's a warranted kind of relationship between person and country. And finally, I don't mean to offer a purely intellectualized praise of the American system, the American constitutional system or other. I'm defending here love of country, and love is supposed to be passionate. I love the country. I love the paper-thin bark on the birch trees in my hometown in Alaska. I love the way the lights sparkle on my left and the wild lake is dark to my right when I drive north at night in Chicago. I love, maybe above all, I love the music that this country has produced and that only this country has produced, the blues and gospel and jazz and rock and roll and all the other forms of American music that express the country's personality. So my way of expressing this love will be philosophical because that's my voice and that's my assignment here, but make no mistake, what I'm offering is a reason to love the country and not just to defend it. So what I mean to defend here is the kind of love you might feel as an adult to another adult. Any person is a complex mixture of virtues and vices, strong points and weak ones, and every adult has a history. And the history is filled with failures, including moral failures, and achievements, including moral achievements. That's why adults are harder to love than babies. Babies don't have the same kind of history. To love as an adult is to acknowledge the whole, including faults, and even try to improve one's beloved, but to do so with a balance in which the overall tenor of thought and feeling is one that valorizes, cherishes, and regards with affection. That's what I'm trying to defend and to justify philosophically. There's actually a lot of defenses of America along these adult love lines. you often hear people arguing that the country is not perfect, but it's better, for example, than the vast majority of others throughout history in producing freedom or prosperity or any number of other goods. Or you hear that the country is not perfect, but it's improving over time, and it has a remarkable ability to improve over time, sort of perfectibility ideal. I don't actually disagree with those whatsoever. I don't mean to minimize or diminish them. It's just that as I was preparing for this panel, I realized that those familiar reasons are not my reasons for loving the country, and so I embarked on a much stranger argument, which I'm going to present now for why I feel as I do. So Hegel, the philosopher Hegel, has a most peculiar conception of freedom. He doesn't think of freedom as just external non-interference, what's commonly called negative liberty. He doesn't disparage external non-interference, he just thinks it's incomplete. He also does not think of freedom simply as what's sometimes called positive liberty, that is, being given the power and resources to realize one's goals in life. That's not his conception of freedom either. Hegelian freedom has to do with being able to live a life in accord with who you really are, a life true to yourself. It's sometimes called freedom as non-alienation. It's a sort of authenticity ideal. Imagine a traditional Hindu Indian in colonized British India. Under British rule, India imposed by force a number of liberal norms. It's conceivable that negative freedom went up in that system and even that positive freedom went up. But Hegelian freedom went down because the native Indians found themselves living in a society that didn't reflect them, in which it was difficult to live a life consistent with who they really were. But think of more prosaically, just think of a young person who, desperately wants to be a musician and is in fact a gifted musician, but his parents prevail on him to be a doctor, which he does and does successfully, but never fully owns, right? It was never who he wanted to be. He wanted to be a musician, never truly who he is. Well, he might not have been coerced, and he might be wealthy, so he has both negative and positive liberty in that sense, but he has an alienated relationship to his own life. He's unfree in the sense of not being able to live an authentic life. By the same token, the ultimate expression of freedom in this sense is like John Coltrane playing saxophone, John Rawls doing philosophy, Steve Jobs founding companies. It's a person with a gift and a passion living a life in which that gift and passion is expressed to its highest degree. I think there's a harmony between this conception of freedom and Aristotle's conception of the good life. So Aristotle, as many of you know, took up the traditional philosophical question of what constitutes a good life, and he argued that it's a life of activity in a way that exhibits excellence or virtue. And riffing on this, revising slightly, I like to think of Aristotle as praising a life in which we engage in some activity excellently and become thereby a point from which good or value flows out into the world. And thus we can combine Hegel and Aristotle to come to the following conclusion. A life of freedom and flourishing is one in which you are engaged in an activity which is authentically and fully your own, an expression of your true self, the thing Hegel valorizes. And in so doing, you're exhibiting human excellence and serving as a point from which excellence or value is flowing out into the world, the thing Aristotle praises. I think that's basically Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics updated for the modern world, a world that valorizes freedom, authenticity, and service to others. So again, I'm putting this in philosophical language, but just think of Coltrane or Rawls or Jobs again. To make music or do philosophies or found companies was, I assume, an expression of their authentic selves. They did so at the highest imaginable level, exhibiting a form of human excellence. And in so doing, they contributed to the world, so they did something socially valuable. They made their authentic talents a source of value into the world. So that's the ideal, I think, is praiseworthy here. And with that, I want to turn to one of my favorite lyrics in the singer-songwriter world, Regina Spektor's On the Radio, and here's the lyric. It's a love song, by the way. Here's what she says. This is how it works. You peer inside yourself, you take the things you like, and try to love the things you took, and then you take that love you made and stick it into someone else's heart, pumping someone else's blood. I think it's appropriate that I'm quoting a love song in what is really a love song myself. This is a love song to America. I think she's identifying, with great insight, something very much like this Hegelian Aristotelian ideal. what she's describing, she's describing a process of falling in love or holding yourself out to others for love. But here's how I want to experience it. You peer inside yourself, and that looking discloses a talent. You discover you're quite good at talking to other people about their feelings, or you're quite good at thinking strategically, or you're quite good with your hands, doing things with your hands. Something discloses some sort of talent. So you find this talent, you try to love the things you took. That's her second layer. You peer inside yourself, you take the things you like and try to love the things you took. So you try to love the things you took. Usually our talents are connected to our pleasures. And upon discovering and developing them, we get reason to esteem ourselves. That pleasure becomes more acute. You discover that you're a good writer and learn to love and appreciate good writing. You discover that you're a good athlete and discover the joys of sports. You discover that you enjoy fixing things and you're good with equipment. You enjoy other people and you're good at helping other people get over their emotions. So then you take that love you made and stick it into someone else's heart, pumping someone else's blood, says Regina Spektor. That's the last stage of this process toward Hegelian freedom and Aristotelian flourishing. You take the talent that is authentically your own, that you came to love, and try to make it a source of value toward others. So just anecdotally, I discovered at some point along the way, I guess it was college, when I had to give up being a musician because I discovered I wasn't that good at it, not good enough. I discovered that I was good at theory. And that's a very peculiar sort of talent, just being good at generating theories. But as I cast around in high school and college and the years immediately following for something that was authentic to me, I found out what I was comparatively good at was making and criticizing theories, and I learned to love that thing I was good at, the life of a scholar in which it was valorized, built that talent to a sufficiently high level that I could make money from it, and went off into the world to be a value to others, a source of values to others. With that observation, I want to pivot to the next piece of my argument, which is the kind of societal preconditions that are necessary to make that life of freedom and flourishing possible. It's not something you can just do on your own. You need a very peculiar sort of society to be able to, for a large number of people, to be able to live that life of Hegelian freedom and Aristotelian flourishing. First of all, you need a very dynamic, prosperous, and open economy. Wealthy enough that it can support a huge range of activities. It takes a lot of wealth to allow anyone to devote themselves to the project of political theory. You also need a society that's open enough that you're not born into or tracked into a sort of station in the world or a particular kind of work. And it needs to be a society open enough to entrepreneurship that you can start something. It also has to be a fairly meritocratic society. It can't just be totally open, do what you like. That's not what I mean to praise. To really flourish on my conception, you need to find a genuine talent, a genuine source of pride, and a genuine way to actually help others, not just something that gives you pleasure. So I had to give up music and go into something else because of what I was really good at. Lots of people have to give up sports. You have to find your way to the pressures, the kind of conversation between world and self that a meritocracy creates are essential to this process. Third, you need a culture of freedom. You need to not be exposed to so much cultural disapproval or control or other kinds of powerful controlling forces that you can't find your particular path through the world. My brother grew up in Fairbanks, Alaska with me, a world of guns, trucks, and churches, and decided he wanted to be an avant-garde New York theater director. That was the identity he wanted, and he lived it. He found his way to it. It takes a lot of cultural freedom to enable that. And it takes a fair amount of democratic political control to enable that. So I can't be exhaustive, particularly in light of the time, but my point is this. It takes a very complicated and rare sort of society to enable Hegelian freedom and political and Aristotelian flourishing. The political, economic, and cultural preconditions for this kind of society are quite rare. And I come now to my final point, which is just that America has developed these social preconditions to a surprising degree. America is a place that at its best gives people a lot of scope to develop their individuality, and when that individuality discloses a socially useful talent, there are diverse ways to build a successful life from that talent. It's not just about the constitutional system. It's not just about the free market, and it's not just about the culture. It's a very complex network of different factors that enable our country to enable that kind of life to a high degree. And so what I'm really presenting here is a philosophical exposition of the American dream. The Oxford English Dictionary defines the American dream as the ideal that every citizen of the United States should have an equal opportunity to achieve success and prosperity through hard work, determination, and initiative. My defense of love of country, love of America, is based on the American dream, but it's a philosophical presentation of what the American dream means. Thanks.
All right. So I have to apologize. This is mostly extemporaneous. But when Josh kindly invited me to participate in this, I confess that my first thought was, oh God, an evening event, the day before I leave. I don't really want to do any more stuff at AALS. But then I thought, even though as the sort of designated discontent on this panel, as such, the like token commie, it's always an awkward position to be in, but I can play to stereotype and begin by reading Langston Hughes at you. And so I shall play to stereotype. I've been doing a lot of work trying to engage the Black American intellectual tradition in constitutional law lately. And, my favorite Langston Hughes poem, I'm not going to read the whole thing at you because time is limited and so are attention spans, but it's Let America Be America Again, which is very much on theme for today. He begins, let America be America again, let it be the dream it used to be, let it be the pioneer on the plain, seeking a home where he himself is free. America never was America to me. And, it goes on like this for a while, and then he closes with, well, how far will we go? We'll go this far. Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet, and yet must be the land where every man is free, the land that's mine, the poor man's, Indians, Negroes, me, who made America, whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain, must bring back our mighty dream again. Sure, call me any ugly name you choose. The steel of freedom does not stain. From those who live like leeches on the people's lives, we must take back our land again. America, oh yes, I say it plain. America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be. There's another stanza after that, but you get the point. So, one way to read that poem as a whole, and I think it's called the sort of shallow reading, would be as a version of what Stephen referred to initially as the sort of, debate over the extent to which the Lockean experiment has been fully carried out, right? A claim there is an America out there, that America hasn't been satisfied if we represent that America as a kind of normative construct, and so that gives rise to the demand to more fully fulfill something like its normative essence. But I don't think that fully captures either the point of Hughes's poem, or I think the lessons that we can learn from reflecting on the various stages of contestation over who actually gets to be counted as a participant in the American dream through its history. I think what we learn from reflecting on that period of contestation is that America is a multiply realizable concept. And where I fear, and this is very much me sort of serving my function as the Federalist Society skeptic, the designated non-federalist in the room, is I think that many, particularly, but not exclusively, on the political right, go wrong by compressing what in reality is an inevitably contested and transforming conception of both a country as a group of members, in other words, a democracy defined by its boundaries, by who's in and who's out, as well as a set of underlying values and goals of aspirations, into a too easy and too clean vision. This is what the normative ideal of America is. And so if you have problems with that normative ideal, it is a failure of attachment to a thing that is attachment worthy, as opposed to a debate about what the underlying thing is. And this is something that we see, again, I've been reflecting a lot on Black intellectual history lately. If you're curious as to one aspect of it, I'll give you a shameless pitch for my last book, which is entitled The Rule of Law in the United States, an Unfinished Project of Black Liberation, from which you can get, I think, an accurately complex picture of its overall orientation. But in that project, which I think of as unfinished, we see, for example, a founding era debate over whether the United States is accurately understood as a kind of property holders republicanism, one in which the notion of private property rights as a foundation for either a Lockean or a more Republican, Harrington-esque kind of freedom is the primary legal and political value, contrasted with a case according to which what the American core normative ideal is more closely related to its treatment of people and to an idea of underlying social, political, and economic equality that, for one thing, rooted many of the claims of abolitionists, which begin but don't end in a, at least in some cases, a theological vision about human equality, but which appears, for example, in James McCune Smith's claim that what abolition would do would be to purify the Constitution, to identify a different conception of what the underlying nature of America is, and more fully achieve that conception of Americanism as against the conception of Americanism expressed, for example, in the secession statements of many of the southern states, which focused primarily on the idea that their great fear was the loss of the unbounded Lockean conception of property rights, which they saw as inhering in slavery. So, what's the point there, right? Well, the point is that any democracy that purports, as the United States does through its documentary tradition, through its history, to instantiate certain kinds of normative values, is both morally multiply realizable and multiply realizable in terms of its identities. And as a person who views himself as a lover of a version of America, albeit perhaps one that many in this room might not fully agree with, I want to identify that the conception of America that to me seems love-worthy is remarkably similar to that expressed by James Baldwin in a lot of his work, right? So, one of the things that Baldwin really focused on in his writing was a kind of love for America, but it was what, political theorists would probably call an agonistic love for America, a love for America that was envisioned as the productive outcome of a necessary and somewhat conflictual transformation, which for Baldwin, of course, primarily focused among conflicts around racial inclusion. Contrast that to a vision of America expressed, for example, by many of the critics, not all associated with the Federalist Society, but many Federalist Society critics of, for example, the principle of birthright citizenship. Right? There was a prominent critique of birthright citizenship that was particularly prominent during the last presidential administration, and that critique was rooted in a conception of a citizen body. You know, the core argument raised by folks like Eastman was that there was a distinctive group of people who were the citizen body and who were entitled to give or withhold consent to the participation of others in that citizen body. Now, I think there's a lot wrong with Eastman's argument. For example, I like to think that that consent was in fact granted in the text of the 14th Amendment. But what I want to identify today is that that argument is rooted in an assumption about a static political demos, about a group of people who are already included, who, in virtue of being already included, get to say, well, I don't give my consent to your admission. Incidentally, it was also an argument raised by Andrew Johnson. In my last book, I describe a meeting which was held between Andrew Johnson and Frederick Douglass, among others, where Douglass, promptly after Johnson took office said, hey, so how about citizenship for us? And Johnson said, well, I wouldn't want to impose that on the people of the South without their consent. To which Douglass's response, in essence, partly was and partly should have been, well, we're already citizens, right? You're assuming a conclusion to the debate. You're assuming an identity of the American people that doesn't include us. But that assumption is contestable. That assumption is debated. And so I claim that I do love America, but that many of us may have very different ideas about the character of the object of that love. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join this discussion, Josh. I think it is a very important one. I'm beginning with a different kind of American poetry, which is the opening scene of The Godfather. I'm sure you've all seen the movie, because if you haven't, you really must hate America. But I'll recap just to refresh your recollection. So the movie opens with an exchange between the Godfather, Don Vito Corleone, and an undertaker named Amerigo Bonacera. And the first words are the undertaker's. He says, I believe in America. America has made my fortune. But then he tells the Godfather that misfortune has befallen his daughter. Her American boyfriend and one of his friends attempted to sexually assault her, and when she resisted, they beat her so badly that she will never be beautiful again. The undertaker continues, I went to the police like a good American, but he laments after the boys were convicted, the judge suspended the sentence. And so, Amerigo says, I said to my wife, for justice, we must go to Don Corleone. And then he asks the Godfather to murder the boys. It's a great scene. You should watch the whole thing. So I'm giving you the short version. So the Godfather, after chastising Bonacera for not showing him sufficient respect, says he won't kill the boys because that would not be just, because the daughter is still living. But he agrees, after the undertaker submits to his authority, that he will give him the justice that his daughter deserves, which is to dispatch some thugs to beat the crap out of the boys. So I think this is an important scene, and it captures in many ways the reason we're having this conversation today. Some, perhaps many, particularly on the left, but also on the right, are now with the undertaker. They've become disillusioned with America. She's let them down. And for justice, they now seek the Godfather. On the left, the Godfather at the extreme might be Antifa or Jane's Revenge, or in the mainstream, the DEI office. And on the right, the Godfather at the extreme might be QAnon, and in the mainstream, Adrian Vermeule. There are shared characteristics of this disillusionment. with America on the left and the right, and I want to talk about three of them here. The first is a rejection of liberalism, small l, what Judge Buzz Arnold liked to call ordered liberty, a rejection of liberalism and a turn to authority. The second, which is probably a subset of the first, but I treat it separately, is a repudiation of the value of the free exchange of ideas. And the third is disillusionment with the rule of law. In my view, the real-world impact of these responses on the left are greater than on those on the right, because the elite controls more social and cultural institutions, the elite left, but I think it's helpful and illuminating to take stock of them on both sides, in particular their commonalities. I also think the Federalist Society as an institution should consider the extent to which younger conservatives are attracted to the right's version of this response to their disillusionment. And I think, as a political conservative, the disillusionment on the right has made it more difficult for conservatives to offer coherent responses to the disillusionment on the left. Okay, but back to my three shared responses to this undertaker phenomenon. The first is a rejection of liberalism and a turn to authority. So on the left, perhaps the most stark, or maybe not on the left, maybe just generally culturally, the most stark recent example was the demand for total submission and deference to public health authorities, the suppression of dissent, and the rejection of the democratic process in favor of emergency executive action during the pandemic. For example, one example only, we shut our schools down for nearly 2 years in many states, even after we knew that the risk to kids was minimal, wreaking havoc on the lives of the most disadvantaged children in our culture and our society, and eviscerating at least 20 years of learning gains. On college campuses, COVID became an excuse as a mechanism for total control. Students were prohibited from interacting and summarily expelled if they transgressed. At Notre Dame, roving bands of COVID monitors, called in the most dystopian fashion, "Here, ambassadors," busied themselves reminding people to pull their masks up between sips of coffee. But even before COVID and after, I think normal patterns of adult human interaction on college campuses have been suspended in favor of interactions that depend on the mediation and control of bureaucrats. In my alma mater, Stanford, students must register their parties with appropriate bureaucrats in advance, providing guest lists and the names of designated sober monitors. This recently prompted the school mascot, the tree, to run onto the football field with a banner that said, "Stanford hates fun." Stanford responded by removing the mascot from his post and promising to hire a new administrator to help students have more fun. The rejection of liberalism on the right can be summed up by the fact that my neighbor, Patrick Deneen's Substack, is called The Post-Liberal Order, and the fact that Roger just moved to Hungary. Okay, so second, the repudiation of the ideal of the free exchange of ideas. So gone are the days of sticks and stones, may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Now words make people feel unsafe, and silence is violence. The examples on the left abound. Of course, the Biden administration proposed, and thankfully tabled, the proposal for a government disinformation bureau. The Defense Department, I read on Twitter, so it must be true, is apparently training AI to detect bias in social media posts. Back at Stanford, the university recently issued, and then retracted, a list of banned words and phrases. Two of my favorites was, "We should not say abort because it might make people think about abortion," or "You should not say trigger warning because the listener might be triggered." Instead, you're supposed to say content notice. And of course, as someone who teaches and talks about controversial topics for a living, for example, education law, I am intensely aware and concerned about cancel culture and the gaslighting of those who complain about cancel culture because, after all, cancel culture doesn't exist. So on the right, I will say that Adrian Vermeule blocked my mother-in-law on Twitter because she liked my husband's tweet criticizing him.
We can agree about that, if nothing else.
My mother-in-law has never not liked one of my husband's tweets. It's actually quite disheartening to me the extent to which the post-liberals, the intellectual right refuse to engage in any debate about their ideas. I think there's a broader cultural phenomenon here of us only looking at each other, our own Twitter feeds, and not, there's like we could have that debate all the time about what that means for the culture. But I do find that this refusal to engage in debate about ideas on the right and the left very disheartening, as well as the viciousness of response to criticism. But I think the problem is deeper than thin skins. I think some on the left, as well as some on the right, simply don't think that we have the right to be wrong. Okay, third, disillusionment with the rule of law. Here, I think I would point to the joint rejection of originalism and textualism on both the right and the left. One need not be originalist maximally or textualist, to be clear, to respect the rule of law. Reasonable people can disagree about the importance of precedent, for example, or the interpretive value of history and legislative history in particular, but I worry very much that there's more to the critiques than reason and respect for the rule of law would allow. In the case called Michigan versus Bennis some years ago, which involved a poor woman she'd lost her car to civil forfeiture because her husband engaged the services of a prostitute in it. Challenged it as a due process violation, and this was rejected. And Justice Thomas observed in concurrence, this case goes to show that the Constitution does not prohibit everything that is intensely undesirable. I worry that some on the left and the right disagree with him about this incontrovertible fact. Some on both sides want the law to be what they want it to be, not what it is. And sometimes they would have unelected judges and bureaucrats impose their will, and their desired results, even when that means subverting the meaning of or ignoring the history and text of the law, including the Constitution. Okay, so those are the three things that I think the left and the right have in common. So what do I say to these critics who reject these three core American values: liberalism, free expression, the rule of law? In some ways, I actually find the diagnosis easier than the treatment. Just to be clear about my priors, I am what my neighbor Patrick Deneen calls a right lib. It's a very bad thing to be, apparently. I'm a conservative Catholic originalist who favors ordered liberty, free expression, and the rule of law. Patrick Deneen also called the Federalist Society the jackals of mammon in the New York Times. And although I am here in my own personal capacity, I do serve on the board of the Federalist Society, so I will say I'm proudly a henchman of the jackals of mammon. Like the Undertaker, I believe in America, and like him, she sometimes lets me down. She lets us all down, more frequently and more catastrophically for some than others. But where the Undertaker and I part ways is that I'm not giving up on America, because I think these ideals that are being rejected on the right and the left, liberalism, free expression, the rule of law, are far better than their alternatives. So for those who reject America's version of liberalism, free markets, free minds, mobility, individualism, meritocracy, including those conservatives who favor an older order, one that is allegedly more stable, rooted in community and faith and family, I might ask how they would respond to Justice Thomas's observation on the day of his nomination that only in America could the great-great-grandchild of a slave raised in poverty in the segregated South rise to serve on the Supreme Court of the United States. Like America, Amerigo Bonacera, America made his fortune. And if I was feeling particularly petulant, I would say, and I have said, that America has made mine, like so many millions of others, including many of you, I suspect, freedom, mobility, meritocracy. They enabled me to overcome obstacles, certainly not the obstacles to the level that Justice Thomas overcame, but obstacles including childhood poverty and family dysfunction, to be here today talking to you about why I love America. To those on the left that say these American ideals are a sham, I might point out that millions of people would and do risk their lives to come to this imperfect country to enjoy its many blessings, and that the most successful immigrant group in the United States is Nigerians. To those that embrace limits on free expression, I would just suggest a short essay by the Catholic theologian Joseph Pieper called Abuse of Language, Abuse of Power. He points out that when language ceases to have meaning, it conveys only power. That's the point, I suppose. But there's a reason why the First Amendment has been so long suspicious of viewpoint-based restrictions on free speech. They hide the ball. How can we confront our limitations as a society and address injustice if certain opinions are off the table? How can we address hard topics like how schools should deal with gender transitioning children if we can't have an honest conversation about whether the 11th Circuit might be right that requiring transgender students to use the bathrooms assigned to their biological sex doesn't violate Title IX? Or how can we address racial injustice if we can't talk honestly about racial preferences or ask the DEI officers why they're hiring pools, they're micromanaging hiring pools to advance amorphous inclusion goals? What do we know of how can we talk about what to do about COVID learning losses if we can't suggest that maybe more choice and not more money is the answer, because many urban public schools have been systematically failing poor minority kids long before COVID? How can we solve our problems if we reject the idea that reasonable debate is something that this country should value and encourage? And for those that question the rule of law, especially those who condemn originalism, textualism, perhaps on the right, and want judges and bureaucrats to substitute their own views of the common good for the history and text of the Constitution, I would suggest they spend some time reading state Supreme Court opinions. For example, as was mentioned in the previous panel, the South Carolina Supreme Court's opinion this week, finding the state's 6-week ban on abortion violated the state's constitutional right to privacy, or the Kentucky Supreme Court's decision last month holding that a modest voucher program for poor kids violated the right to a public education. There are many moral and philosophical justifications for originalism and textualism, some that have been made by many of you in this room, but I am not a philosophical person. I'm a practical one. And I will say that in my view, if, as a conservative, but also if I was a liberal, asking judges and bureaucrats to substitute their personal predilections about what is just for the rule of law is not likely, in many cases, to produce the desired results. It is rather an invitation to lawlessness. So when Mario Puzo wrote The Godfather, I think he chose the Undertaker's name for a reason. We call ourselves Americans, a word that should not be used at Stanford, because of an Italian explorer named Amerigo Vespucci. In that sense, the Undertaker's name, Amerigo Bonacera, means good night, America. Literally translated, it means good evening, ruler. And there are many in this great country that are ready to say good night to America or good evening to an alternative, but I am not among them. And I would say that none of us should be. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. We'll now do a few minutes each for any thoughts that you have on comments from the others or any other ways that you'd like to revise and extend your remarks. So 4 to 5 minutes or so. And why don't we go sort of down the line?
I guess I'd like to start with a conversation with Paul. Paul, what bothers me about the what I heard from you today and what I hear from other friends and foes on the left is they say, it's not that I don't love America. I love what America could be but isn't yet. Or I love America in flashes but not in general. I don't love this meritocracy thing. I don't love this capitalism thing. Or I don't love, it's sort of, it's not loving the actual instantiated America, but saying I still love it. I just love it if it were essentially a European social democratic order or something like that. And here's what I object to with that. I don't think that's love. If someone said to me, I would love you if you were skinnier, more practical, and calmer, I'd be like, well, that's just... It's just not loving me, right? That's loving something you wish I were, right? It's just, it wouldn't be like spousal love. My take on what love is I thought about this sentence. To love as an adult to an adult is to acknowledge the whole, including faults, and even try to help one's beloved improve. It's consistent with improvement. But to do so with a balance in which the overall tenor of thought and feeling is one that valorizes, cherishes, and regards with affection. It has to take the actual existing thing, person, country, and genuinely, as a whole, valorize, cherish, and regard with affection. The level of critique and demand for change, the scope of the change that I think you're asking for, and that others of your political orientation are asking for is inconsistent with that kind of love. What do you think?
So, here's the thing, right? Countries ain't people. Right, like the thing about, my relation to you is that I can say, okay, there's a Josh, and I can identify the characteristics of Josh. Of course, no person is uncomplicated, simple description, but a corporate entity, and particularly a corporate entity like the United States, which has been characterized from the moment it's born by deep fundamental disagreements over both the values that it's meant to carry out and also even who's in the room, right? I don't think it's possible to take that kind of attitude towards such an entity, right? And this is why I find, when I think about love of country, I find Baldwin as my touch point, because a persistent theme in Baldwin's writing is a kind of love, but a love that reflects that, it's complicated and contested, and part of the reason that it's complicated and contested is because Baldwin really wanted to love a country that was composed of Black Americans and white Americans on equal terms relating to one another as such, and Baldwin didn't have that country available. But Baldwin saw that the way that Americans of both races and other races expressed what they thought America was or could be included that. And so his love, it was, think about, we could call it parental love if we wanted, right? Because much like children, a country in this sense, I would suggest, is forever not fully formed. Right, and so it is acceptable for a parent to say, I love you, but, I really think that you should stop eating pizza and cupcakes for every meal. And, that's not acceptable for fully formed adults, but a nation is never fully formed. Minerva hasn't spread her wings yet.
Or her owl.
Yeah,
Do you think that Baldwin's sort of stance to America, there's an ideal expressed by black and white alike, which I love, but it's utterly unrealized, and I can't love the America I occupy. Do you think Baldwin's, the tenor of Baldwin's emotional relationship there to American or to patriotism in 2022 is consistent with real love of country?
I do, right? I mean, here's the thing. So, we're bringing Nicole into this conversation too, right? I mean, a few things that I was struck by about Nicole's remarks. I think one of which is less directly on this topic, which is, strikingly as a left lib. When I think about illiberalism in America, I think about the fact that technically my last book, which is extremely pro-rule of law, violates Tennessee's critical race theory ban. I've actually considered suing. I talked to a civil rights lawyer friend of mine, and he said, are you mad you're the least sympathetic plaintiff ever? Don't. But I considered it. But the other thing that I heard that that's very much along these lines is, as Nicole pointed out, lots and lots of people come to the United States and, through an intense risk to try to achieve participation in the thing that they see America as. But a lot of those risks and dangers are risks and dangers that we do to them. Right? I mean, not all. Not all, certainly a lot of people, for example, have passed through gang-held territory and all sorts of other dreadful things to get here. But our immigration policy, the shining city on a hill that has an entire statue, like reflecting the notion that we value immigrants, where some of the core arguments even of our founders, where in Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance, one of the key arguments against subsidies for religion is that it would deter immigration to our shores, right? This country that has built its sort of public normative identity Society on being a welcome place to immigrants, like hires Border Patrol officers who routinely see caches of water left for people who are crossing the desert by like nonprofit groups and destroy those caches of water to deter people, to make it more unsafe to come to this country. And so, yes, I absolutely think that attitude is appropriate. I think that part of a Baldwin-esque attitude is to say, I love the ideal that's expressed on our Statue of Liberty. And, you know, right now, like, it is abominable that we betray that ideal at every level of our immigration policy.
So, did you want to? Wait, sorry.
So I guess I would add, I thought this was really interesting listening to both of you. I mean, so Paul, you discuss sort of to what Josh says is like the love of the critic as the love of a parent. I just wonder whether or not that's true. I mean, in the sense that like parental love is unconditional, and I think that some of the criticism isn't like loving a teenager. So I have 4 children, and I have 1 teenager. 2 are kind of past that, which is great. 1's coming up, which is not good. But in any event, the teenager's tough, right? So I love her unconditionally because she's growing into who she will be. But in the end, for me to say, I want you to become somebody different than you are, is not parental love. That's something else. Now, I might not like who she is going to become, and she drives me nuts. But I think loving a teenager is one thing, and saying, I want you to be somebody other than you are, that's not parental love, that's not unconditional love. And to Josh's point, I would say, I love the love story, and I'm kind of a person who's waiting for Ronald Reagan to come back. I mean, but I wonder whether we start talking past each other about the love story that you tell, because there are so many people now, the disillusioned ones don't believe any of the priors. Just to talk about the benefits and the blessings of the priors, the ones that I identify, is to talk about you're just talking in another language, because those are just not good things. I mean, they are fundamental. Is there, to what extent on the left and the right, is there just a fundamental rejection of what America is? Maybe it's the same question asked differently.
So one question that I want to sort of throw into the mix is one of timing, in 2 ways. One question I want to ask about timing is sort of why now? Why is now a time when these ideas are sort of subject to more question or carry less purchase or are regarded with greater hesitance than at other times in our history when, Lord knows, we had plenty of problems then too? A second question about timing is about the relationship of these ideals to history. Because sort of as presented, as we've talked about, they're in some sense sort of ahistorical. They're enjoyed at a particular moment. Right now, we can pursue these ideals. And maybe we're not living up to them enough, but we can do better. One day we will run faster, reach out our arms further, and so on, as in the closing words of Gatsby. But for a lot of folks, problems with America are in some sense foundational. They're sort of rooted in features of our past, and whether that's the violence of expansion or of slavery, or whether it's features of sort of the Lockean experiment in the sense that it's sort of an attachment to a distracting distorting freedom, a sort of libertinism that distracts us from ultimate human goods. I think for a lot of critics of American ideals, there's no improving your way out of this, either because it sort of is a fact that can't be changed in the past, or because the ideals themselves are to be rejected. And I'm curious as to all of your thoughts on these 2 questions, both the present question, why now, and the past question, how should we regard America's past?
I'll try. I'll try to speak to both. With the timing question, I think what happened was a generation of people who you could say have I called it demanding love, a critical love. It's a kind of relationship where you say, I'm going to express my affection for the country by criticizing it constantly, because that's the highest form of in America of expressing affection for the country, or maybe it's a Baldwinian love. I love the ideal, but it hasn't been achieved, so I'm going to demand that it be achieved. There's generational transmission, and ideas and emotions change in transmission. If generation 1 has that Baldwinian or demanding love relationship to the country, generation 2 has bare antagonism, and generation 3 has bare hostility. And so what we've seen is a sort of warping of the underlying emotions through generational transmission. That's my explanation of the timing. It's just, the question was who are the parents and the grandparents? I do think that the foundations of the country have come under attack. And the one I would single out as an example is actually the meritocracy. I mean, as you can see from what I'm praising this form of society in which society is putting certain kinds of demands and competitive pressures on you, and you peer inside yourself and find something you like, or take something you like and love the thing you took. You find yourself discloses some talent that you can then realize as a source of value in society. That's a particular take on what the meritocracy is and how it functions. And I think the level of egalitarianism we now encounter, and the level of doubts about our economic system and otherwise have brought that entire meritocracy under question. And that's why I feel like the foundations of the whole, I mean, you asked, is this just a failure, you asked Paul whether this is just a failure to have attachment to something which is attachment worthy, or whether it's asking for the country to better realize its own ideals. Well, I take it that at the root of the whole thing, without which it would just be a different country, is to get rid of that open-ended meritocracy where you have to peer inside yourself and find a talent. And I feel like it's under attack now.
As far as timing goes, I blame the parents. I mean, look, I've been teaching this is my 24th year, and the young people increasingly, it's just like I do think there's the demand for egalitarianism, equity over equality and opportunity, words that becoming, hurtful and not being able to say things. I really do think, and, I'm a millennial parent, that the younger professionals were raised not just by helicopter parents, but by they call them lawnmower parents, because it's not just that you drop in when they need you, but you plow through all of the obstacles with the lawnmower. I mean, I was a latchkey Gen X kid of divorced parents, so I think it's a wholly different thing. And I think that you see culturally that is one of we're reaping what we sowed when we raised kids in this way. Now, there are very deeper problems that have led to this, but I think that the cultural reaction, especially among American elites, is in part just because of the way that it all comes down to participation ribbons, or as a friend of mine said, kindergarten graduations. But I saw this during the Kavanaugh nomination, and whatever you thought about the debate about it, one thing that was really interesting to me as a Gen X latchkey kid is how many younger people said, "Where were the adults?" And I was like, I don't remember where they were. And so literally, I have no memory of adults in my teenage years. And so I do think that part of it is just a cultural change in the way we're not raising our kids to be flinty and Americans. And the other thing might be also the moment is good, which is that we're much better educated. The increasingly better educated people are more likely to see more injustice more quickly. But I do think that there are these social factors. To your point, Steve, about why this moment, I think there are these social factors that are influencing the particular turn from liberalism in particular.
So, I mean, it might not surprise you to think that I have a different perspective on this. And I think my perspective is that I fear that you all have your I wouldn't say you have your facts wrong, so much as you have your emphases wrong, right? So what have we heard, I think, really on this panel as the sort of two primary examples of, like, people on the left turning their back on the American project, right? The first thing I've heard is the sort of, the DEI thing. Now, I am a person whose the subtitle of his last book includes the phrase Black Liberation, who teaches critical race theory. So you can probably guess where I am on this, but I think you'd actually guess partly wrong. Right, because I am actually the first to say it, I've said this to the press, that there have been, I won't even call them excesses, but I would say there have been errors in how well-meaning bureaucrats, frankly, have carried out ham-fisted efforts to achieve racial justice, right? Like, the whole notion of, like, school children doing privilege walks or something, that's idiotic. It's also nothing that anybody who has actually, like, studied or taught critical race theory or written in the subject would ever endorse. It's what happens when you ask a bunch of bureaucrats to implement some policy and they do it badly. Where you say, like, hey, bureaucrats, like, create racial diversity, and then you give it to somebody who, like, has a master's degree in education and has no idea what's going on. I mean, yeah, that's what happens. It's bad, but it's not like some deep-rooted illiberalism. It's just bureaucracy. Yes, bureaucracy. I was probably half of this room is libertarians. I think you'll agree with me that bureaucracy generates stupid stuff sometimes. That happens in all kinds of directions. And that actually is a transition point to the second thing I've heard, which is something about meritocracy or capitalism. And what I find really interesting about that example of how the left has allegedly turned against the American project is that a lot of what gets associated with that on the left probably would be familiar, even again, to, like, certain kinds of, libertarian economists, right? Like, I don't think there's a lot of air between Elizabeth Warren and Hayek, for example, right? Like, I know, right? I know, I love that. But the reason I don't think a lot of, if you asked Elizabeth Warren, I predict, and I mean, she's not here, I can't tell you, I may be putting words in her mouth. I am definitely putting words in her mouth. But I think that if you asked Elizabeth Warren, hey, is the economy right now structured as a free market, she'd say no. And I think if you asked her, would it be better if it was structured as a free market, she would say yes. I think if you asked the same question to, Lena Khan or Tim Wu, you'd get similar answers. Right? Again, I think they just have different conceptions of the kinds of regulations that might be necessary to create a free market. Right? And I think that, there's a connection between these two things because, of course, the second place where folks on your side of the political aisle love to point to the DEI industry and say that it's a rejection of liberalism is when it comes out through, like, corporations, right? When, like, your favorite airline or soda company or whatever declares that it's going to, like, host a diversity event and, pull its ads from some right-wing publication or whatever. But wait a minute, I thought that was capitalism, right? Oh wait, no, what you're identifying, what the right critics of social media companies are also identifying, for example, is that, like, market power is a thing that exists, that, at a certain level of market power, there's a tension between that and liberal values. So we're really all, like, arguing about the same stuff, right? Like, I actually don't think that, like, the serious people on the left have turned away from liberalism at all, frankly. I mean, some people have, sure. Some people always have. But I think that what we really have, on theme with my claim that America itself is multiply realizable, is I think we have disagreements about what liberalism amounts to. Sorry.
Yeah, so if folks have questions, I invite you to come up to the microphone. Please identify yourself as you do so, because even if we know you, other folks in the room might not.
Ben Johnson, Penn State Law. So, Paul, I had the great fortune of being stuck in the Chicago airport for way too long, and I came across The Price of the Ticket, and it was my first chance to read James Baldwin. And so I'm about a quarter of the way through it. It's my plane book that I take whenever I fly. And so I was thinking about him before you started talking, and then you said it, I was like super excited. So I have a very bad James Baldwin question for you, because I'm only a quarter of the way through, so I apologize. So Baldwin strikes me as somebody who actually lived the kind of Hegelian kind of love that Josh talked about. He actually really did achieve this and was able to become who he really was. And I think that he appreciated that most of all about America. I think he recognized that America was alone in the world as the kind of place where someone like James Baldwin could truly be James Baldwin, with all of the like inward struggle and outward struggle and everything else. And I think that that was something that he loved, even separate apart from all of the failures that America recognized. But there's something else, and I'm only to like 1960 in the thing. So help me, don't spoil the ending if you would. But the thing that Baldwin writes a lot about is that to be a black American in that time was to be the most American, right? Because you could not be black. You looked around at black people the rest of the world, they had literally nothing in common. On the other hand, you were not allowed to be fully American in a sense. But what Baldwin comes to understand is that really America in the 1940s and 50s, there's just what it is to be a white American is to hold yourself above being a black American. And what it is to be a black American is to constantly be fighting against this like massive systemic oppression at every level of society, public and private, right? And so what I kind of wonder is, and you might be tempted to fight this hypothetical, but go with me for a minute. But I wonder if we've entered a world where both the official sorts of like this sort of oppression and even the kind of cultural sense that like rap, hip hop, NBA, all like black culture is, if not almost like dominant in many ways in the social life, it's certainly on par with like country music or other kind of like white kind of cultural things. And so Baldwin's view of what it was to be an American and you love America because you love yourself and you're an American. Like Baldwin's like, I'm an American and I love myself and therefore must love America in some sense. Like Baldwin kind of saw, like with segregation ending, that Southern whites were going to have like no idea of who they were going to be anymore. If they were no longer allowed to forcibly keep themselves away from black people, they would not know who they were anymore. And he like saw that coming. And so I'm wondering to what extent is like America just kind of on a Baldwin going through an identity crisis, right? Where like under Baldwin's sense, the way we used to know how to love this place was built around the way people who look different held themselves apart. And now we're just kind of at a loss for what it means to it's a new world. Like, so how would James Baldwin like live in this world? Like it would just be it's a completely different world now in some sense. And so there's you almost need a new way of loving yourself, a new way of interacting, of recognizing yourself in the American story and a new way of loving the country as a result. It's probably inchoate, and I'm sorry, but I just learned so much from Baldwin. And you seemed the guy who asked us a question, so I just wanted to ask.
No, thank you. That's really, I think that, Baldwin's own story, of course, is somewhat more complicated than that. And, there was a substantial part of Baldwin's life that America did not accept and welcome, namely the fact that he was gay. And so, but I actually think that's important. Because in a lot of ways, one way to tell the story, again, this is a very person on the left's version of the story of the last few decades is, for a while, basically until the Black Lives Matter movement was so hey about this police thing, most Americans sort of thought that the battlefield had shifted from racial inclusion to things like inclusion of people who weren't straight, or inclusion of, various other sort of, less canonical identity-based conflicts in the United States. And I think that, the last few years have suggested that maybe the terrain hadn't shifted as much. And so I guess that, maybe that's where I should just stop, is I'm not certain that I'm as confident about the nature of sort of fixed American ideals, or even fixed American sort of fixed identity of who counts as a full-fledged equal citizen, as I might have thought I was 10 years ago.
Other thoughts?
Hi, Andy Koppelman, Northwestern Law School. So as I was hearing you guys talk, I thought, there is this odd ambivalence about American identity, because any particular national identity is very particular. Some of the things that Josh talked about, just peculiar things that are wonderful about local American culture. Jazz and blues and Regina Spektor, those are, just peculiar things about round here. And any particular geographical area has, just sort of the traditional, the way we've done things round here. It's the sort of conservatism that Roger Scruton writes about. And then in America, it is coupled with this attachment to an abstraction, a certain kind of vision of liberalism that isn't local at all. And a big part of American identity post-World War II is that we are the hegemon of liberalism, that we are the central military power that tries to maintain order, make the world safe for free trade and all of that. And from the standpoint of a liberal, you could be attached to America just because it's nice to have a rule of law hegemon and there's nobody else who can do it after the collapse of the British Empire except us. And so we got a responsibility to step up. But, could be anybody as long as they're liberal. And the terrifying thing about the prospect of the United States being replaced as a hegemon by China is that China just doesn't care about any of that stuff. And it's important to have a hegemon that does care about that stuff. And so that's not particularly peculiar. But that means that we can be attached to both of those things, but the attachment to the liberalism is going to depend on the idea that liberalism makes a safe space for the things that we love. And the betrayal of the Undertaker in The Godfather is that he finds out that this regime does not, in fact, protect the things that he loved. He wanted a regime that protected his daughter, and the rule of law has failed. And I think that some of the discontents of contemporary American politics are people who think that they've been failed in that way, that the folks on the left who have given up on liberalism, they think that they're not being taken care of. And so then that generates the kind of tribalism that I'm concerned about. And then the whole America First movement on the right. Again, who cares about the rest of the world? I'm not going to give a penny to Ukraine. We're here to, look after us first. And they represent the same kind of despair as you see in The Undertaker, who, basically, the opening of The Godfather is about someone who chooses to revert to feudalism. I want a powerful protector. There is no universal. And so if you're going to sustain liberalism, you got to look after those grievances and, generate, again, that kind of buy-in and on a Hegelian note, do something about the alienation.
So I'm going to go back to the parental love thing. So I do think you're right. The Undertaker has, America has let him down and he's abandoning it. So the line that I didn't read is, the Godfather says, the Undertaker, I understand. You didn't need a friend like me. You had a good trade. You found paradise in America. You made a good living and there were courts of law. You didn't need a friend like me. Then he goes on to say, but if you had made a friend like me, those men would be suffering this very day, and if by chance an honest man like yourself would make enemies, then they would be my enemies and they would fear you. So I think the question, though, if you think the parental analogy, is we let our kids down all the time, right? I mean, maybe not you all, but like I just screw up all the time. And so, but I hope that my children still love me, recognizing that the ideal of my love is something that they're seeking to perfect. I think the real question, Andy, is to what extent, on the left and the right, is this, is the Undertaker just seeking vengeance, but he's still in his heart of hearts believes, like even though we failed, it's still a good thing? Or is he just and the analogy, because we could go on and on about the Undertaker, but or is it just that the whole thing is rotten to the core because of the limitations, that the courts of law really are a sham, and therefore we should just give up altogether? And I think that to Steve's question about the timing, the question about this moment is to what extent on the left, perhaps less so on the right, but maybe on the right too, are people just in that latter camp? It's not just the failure of a parent who loses her temper and makes a mistake that can be corrected, but it's like, we're done with this. The whole thing was a sham to begin with. I think that the answer to that question is it's pretty important, and that it says a lot about how serious this moment that we are facing is. Because you are correct, America has to be at her core an ideal. Because there's so much diversity in our country, if we don't have that ideal that we share, then I think the thing falls apart.
I have a lot of thoughts in response, and I'm trying to organize them. I just want to, when I love my wife or my children, I'm not just loving an idea or an ideal or a system. I'm loving something much more concrete and particularized, and I feel exactly the same way about this country. I'm not just loving liberalism, which could theoretically fail here and be transplanted somewhere else or be realized somewhere else. I'm not just loving our constitutional system. I tried to point out societal, that is cultural, economic, and political preconditions of being able to live a life of Hegelian freedom and Aristotelian flourishing. That was part of my argument. But it's really very particular. Paul, I think this is a response to you. I have a very particularized idea of what it means to love something. It is not loving a potential, an idea, an abstraction, or a system. It is loving a thing, an entity. It is highly particularized. And I think that particularized and concrete thing or entity is attractive to others who begin to scrutinize whether they should or would want to imitate certain of its features. And of course, because it's such a successful enterprise, we become very powerful and project a lot of power abroad. And so everyone sort of has a stake in what's going on in America, but it doesn't take away the particularism that we should. I actually worry about it with FedSoc folks. I so often hear, praise of the system, the market, the Constitution, without the particularity that I think is really loveworthy. Just a thought.
So, I don't know. I kind of want to go around the room and sort of take a poll of what you all think about Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech, right? Because I feel like, this is going to be my cynical take on, the FedSoc orientation in the world. I think that, there's a sense in which you all have to sort of formally say, yeah, Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech, that's awesome, because, Douglass has sort of been raised to the canon of, people in the core of the American tradition who people point to as hey, this is the most American way of being the abolitionist, and he's part of the canon. There's Douglass, and then there's Dr. King, and there we go, right? But the thing about Douglass's 4th of July speech is it sort of starts with hey, this was a sham from the start. And this is my plea for complexity maybe, right? You can think, hey, this was a sham from the start, and also think, hey, the way that this sham was expressed is a way that is loveworthy and can be brought to fruition, right? So Douglass is, in a way, he kind of holds two thoughts that are contrary in his head at the same time, and is sort of consciously playing with them, right? His first thought is, well, I'm speaking to my fellow Americans, and I'm speaking about our national tradition. And his second thought is, but oh, by the way, you and your founding fathers, you didn't offer this tradition to me. And he can hold those thoughts at the same time because there's a genuine ambiguity, because at the very same time that, Douglass had not that long ago been a Garrisonian, and, Garrisonian, of course, thought that the Constitution was a covenant with hell and an agreement with death, and Douglass, didn't change a lot of his beliefs in stopping being a Garrisonian, but he could at the same time think, well, you've never treated me as a citizen and I'm not part of this, and this has been a sham from the start because it's built on a foundation of slavery, and think, I have actually always been a citizen from the start, and as a person who has always been entitled to citizenship from the start, the vision of America that has me always entitled to citizenship from the start is one that I value and love and can give a speech in honor of. And the ability to hold those two thoughts in the same time, what many critical race theorists have described as multiple consciousness. Marie Matsuda has a wonderful short article about this called When the First Quail Crawls that talks about other instances of the sort of dual identification and critique, right? It's the same thing that appears again in Langston Hughes's claim, both that America has never been America to him, and that it is him who made America, whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain, must bring back our mighty dream again, right? Simultaneously, the claim that there is an again, that there is a dream to bring back, and that dream has never existed. Those are thoughts that you can hold. So I reject utterly the question that is preferred by the suggestion that it's either believing it's all a sham from a start or seeing an actually existing America and its particularity and love it. Those aren't the choices that are available, or at least not the only choices.
Yeah, it's 2045. What do you hope for, and what do you see the country being like?
Judge Arnold, I'm sure some of you may know Judge Buzz Arnold, but he was a bit of a libertarian. He is a bit of a libertarian, and he used to laugh. He'd say, I just want to live long enough to hear the first shots of the counter-revolution. It's interesting. I think it's a great question, Jean. I was born after the 60s. I was born in 1970, so I don't know. I think that we don't really, if you lived through the 60s, you couldn't have predicted Ronald Reagan, right? I just don't know that we have any idea what will be, or what, I know what I would like. I would like to see, I was at Stanford in the late 80s, early 90s, when it was like the first peak of PC nonsense, and there was a backlash, and then it was I think kind of a norm return where we kind of went back to where you didn't have to step so gingerly about what you said, and so I'd like to see that we would see those things happen again as they have throughout American history, but I don't think we can predict.
This is going to be my version of the sort of fear side. So I'm going to put the elephant in the room out. Today is still January 6th. It's 2023, but we know what happened 2 years ago. And what happened 2 years ago was frankly terrifying. Whenever I talk to folks who are on the political right, I know that many of you are just as disturbed by the events then, but I feel like I feel like maybe people on the left, I feel like very few people are appropriately terrified by the fact that there was literally an armed mob that attacked the United States Capitol to attempt to prevent the peaceful transfer of power. That's some I don't even know what country to compare it to, right? But it's not anything that I think, the last time that happened is another period of history that we don't talk about a lot in the US, namely the redemption period, where of course many white terrorist groups used force to seize control of the states in the South and brought in the long darkness of Jim Crow. We don't talk about that stuff. So I guess my hope for 2045, to be perfectly frank, is I'm probably similar to Nicole's in the sense that I live at a very bare level, as I'd like us to have a liberal democracy still. Maybe that's too low a standard, the soft tyranny of low expectations, but it would be nice.
I'd like to see a restoration of the basic liberal project, the project of talking on the basis of reason about ideas, where you can speak without fear of enmity, to have that project prevail in our institutions, universities and otherwise. I think some of, this is a little bit separate from my remarks here prior to today, but my remarks here today prior to now, but I think, as you know, Gene, my diagnosis of the problem is that there is an ideologically unified cultural elite with control, almost hegemonic control of American institutions. And I'd like to see that broken with a much more robust kind of democratic control of the country. So I believe that an America that reflects the will of its people, a majority of its people to a greater degree, would be one in which the anti-American trends on both the right and the left that Nicole identified are actually not very powerful. Those are essentially elite trends on both the right and the left. And I think a more majoritarian country would tend to reattach itself to the basic premises of the American project, including my idiosyncratic conception of Hegelian freedom and Aristotelian flourishing, and a more conventional conception of liberalism. I'd like to see a restoration of that through radically democratic power.
Well, we have reached the conclusion of our time and of our conference. Thank you very much to our panelists and to all of you, and see you next year.